Everything in New Orleans tends to be unique, good or bad. There's so many different traditions and cultures situated in this small city, some more infamous than others, like, the city's gang culture, and that's what we will be discussing today. I have to acknowledge that many people will already be screaming New Orleans don't have a gang culture, but nah, that is false. A myth created from the ignorance and corruption of police and low-key racism. NOPD didn't think any blacks could handle the drug market in an organized manner, which many early drug dealers used as a cover to remain nameless and under the radar. So this is the origin story of Nola's gang culture, beginning in the 1950s. For majority of New Orleans history, it's been a party city. This means things like drugs are always in high demand. On top of that fact, New Orleans is a port city, meaning a lot of drugs are passing in and out of the city in one way or another. As far back as 1926, researchers were referring to New Orleans as the hypodermic needle feeding the entire Middle West with illicit drugs. The Italian Mafia controlled the drug market in New Orleans up until around 1951, when Louisiana passed a new drug law that gave out 10-year mandatory sentences for first-time drug offenders aimed at the Mafia, and it worked. Several Mafia figures were arrested, which resulted in 10-year sentences for them. Mobster Frank Mastricavo was arrested on July 8, 1950 in front of his business as a part of an operation investigating drug trafficking out of businesses in the French Quarter. He took them back to his apartment where they found 11 ounces of heroin at a street value of about $150,000 at the time. This was the first major blow to the New Orleans Mafia. His apartment was located at 838 Charter Street. This law became known as the Boggs Act, which is now infamous for green-lighting unusually long and harsh sentences that cities all over the country adopted. This resulted in the Mafia abandoning the drug operation in the French Quarters. It is true the Mafia gave up the drug businesses to blacks because it brought too much attention and violence. They decided the danger and now the jail time just wasn't worth it. With this, the drug market moved to the projects, with the Calliope taking control first. Up until around 1954, it was said Italians brought the stuff in and gave it to black boys out their corner stores to sell. Those without Italian connections went north to places like Chicago and New York and brought the stuff back themselves. New York took over as the major port for drugs since the largest distributor in the country at the time was the French Connection, which went through New York ports. All these conditions started making a lot of black men rich, with New Orleans drug peddlers becoming dubbed the black heroin kings of the nation, since at this time law enforcement didn't think black people could handle an operation that rivaled the Mafia. Central City basically became the hub for drugs in New Orleans, with the Calliope and the Magnolia projects basically taking control of the entire market. NOPD got the first taste of a black heroin king when the biggest drug bust of the time occurred. Robert Johnson, a 32-year-old black man, was arrested on Bienville in North Roman after agents witnessed a drug deal. Law enforcement had been investigating him for about 6 months and observed him go to the Middle East and the Middle West. Johnson was the city's biggest supplier at the time. NOPD had stated he was supplying most low-level dealers. His last trip, they observed him buy 32 ounces of heroin. 3 weeks later, when they arrested him, he had sold 11. Though still clueless to the level of organization in the streets at the time, they made another big arrest in 1956 when the Hannan Brothers gang was booked after being investigated and observed running a large-scale operation in a vacant lot in the 3300 block of Charter Street. 6 people were arrested, including the brothers Frank Hannan and John Hannan. By the end of the decade, NOPD knew where the dope was coming from, mostly New York. When 2 men were arrested at a Masson airport after learning a large shipment was coming in. They were arrested at the airport with 10 ounces of heroin on them and envelopes worth around $100,000. Law enforcement thought they were cleaning the streets. They had no idea. Now, it's the 1960s and the police make a major arrest, but they don't even know that it's major at this time. Ulysses June Fat Tanner, one of the 3 godfathers of the Calliope. L. Broadnax, Fat Tanner, and a young Sam Scully. It is extremely hard to find information during this period on these men, especially Broadnax and Tanner. He was arrested with 8 other men for running a drug and gun peddling ring in the Calliope projects. Fat Tanner goes and does real time in the feds. His charges were possession of heroin and possession of marijuana, resisting arrest, possession of stolen property, and a hold for a federal alcohol tax unit and a federal narcotics unit. This information comes from newspaper articles that I found coming from the 1960s and the late 1950s period. And this is basically the only things that mention these people named other than L, aka Eldridge Broadnex. He had minor robbery charges when he was young. So I assume he was smart enough to never ever make too much noise to where his name was in the newspapers again, or he was actually known for doing what he was doing. Everybody was getting in on the money, and in 1961, the quote-unquote merchant gang, a group of men selling heroin out of the Seafarers International Union located at 523 Bienville Street, most of them were seamen, sold around the French Quarter, an area that was now dry heroin since whites didn't want to travel to the projects. They say it was one of the biggest and most organized dope peddling rings discovered in the city, which was ran by a man named Rufus McDowell, and they pulled in at least $50,000 a month, and all of these men were black men. Now I can go on all day with these drug busts. I done found a lot in going through these newspaper archives. They got bigger and bigger with more organization as time went on. I will do short, quick history lessons on these busts just to show y'all the magnitude from which it progressed, the amounts they found as time progressed through the 60s, because we about to jump to the early 70s when Fat Tanner got out, because this one it got real. According to the excellent journalism done by YouTube page Video Wayne Narrated, when Fat Tanner got out of jail, he had a connection to New York gangster Frank Lucas, who supported him with the best work in the city. This made a young Sam Scully envious, and he and L Broadnex went to Fat Tanner, who only dealt in the Calliope at this time, for an alliance. Fat Tanner denied. This angered Sam Scully. This eventually resulted in a shootout in the Calliope between Fat Tanner and Sam Scully, where Tanner was shot. After this, Sam Scully was never able to get the Frank Lucas connect from Tanner. Soon after, Sam started dating Tanner's daughter, so the beef died down a bit. And this ended the 70s off, and the 80s is when things started to take off for the worse. L Broadnex was killed in his home downtown somewhere that only his loved ones knew about. This gave Sam Scully more power since he didn't have to share it with him anymore. This was in 1982. Soon after, Fat Tanner goes back to prison, and in 1988, that is where he died, making Sam Scully Clay the last of the black heroin kings of New Orleans. And this brings us into a new era of the Clay organization, of the crack era. Stay tuned.